because Trish and Fry, and they went back and forth all day yesterday, all day today. And at this point, it's discouraging. So, and Emmy is refusing. If anyone else tried to hold up.
So make sure you use the one from this morning. Yeah, that's what I did.
It wasn't at all. He just truly couldn't remember that he wasn't there. He was sweet. He just never knew my name.
Okay. Does this work? Test? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to call our final meeting of the year for the Medical Marijuana Testing Advisory Council to order. It's either 9:09 or 9:01, depending on what clock you're looking at, I guess. Anyway, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we have a quorum. Let's just do a quick roundtable to verify who's here. We'll start down here with Joe.
You push it on, hold the mute until it turns on.
Okay, thanks, buddy. Joe Demena, registered qualifying patient.
Matt Lascala, dispensary agent.
Stephanie Elzinga, Department of Health Services.
Jessica Rigler, Department of Health.
Blake Neary, registered designated caregiver.
Tabitha Howard, lab owner.
Maury Stein, dispensary agent.
Ryan Hurley, Arizona Dispensary Association.
Hope Jones, laboratory scientist.
Steve Cottrell, Marijuana Industry Trade Association.
George Griffith, Cannabis Lab Association.
Vince Figurelli, Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory.
Tom Salo with the department.
Megan Whitby with the department.
And Steve Baker with the department.
Great. thank you all so much. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. When you speak into the microphone, if you can identify yourself before you speak, that would be great. I'm just going to do a quick run through of the agenda. We'll overview the committee's charge, then we're going to revisit that final conversation on pesticides that we left open at the last meeting. And then we're going to get into some discussion on sample collection and storage, and we've got some submissions from members and someone from Ryan's shop coming to talk to us. We'll talk about remediation, retesting, and disposal. We've got some additional items that were submitted by council members for discussion, as well as a couple that I want to make sure that we address, and some cleanup of motions. And then we'll talk about the final report. So I'll be leaving about 15 minutes at the end of this meeting to have a discussion regarding the final report. And then we will wrap up and adjourn. So let's get started here. Just briefly to review the council's charge, you can see this again. You're all here to make recommendations to the department regarding the things on this bulleted list, and we'll take these recommendations and use them to inform our rulemaking process that we do very shortly after this meeting. Okay, so going back to our pesticide discussion. At the last meeting, we had an approved motion for all final products to be tested for pesticides at all, listed in the Oregon Table 2, and there's a link there. The only thing that we did not decide on at the time was methylparathion, because there was some discussion about whether it required a different column. All right.
This is Marie.
This is Murray Stein, dispensary agent. I'm going to bring this up again because it's a really critical thing, and I did include this in submission of a short presentation we provided, and this is my Steve Baker moment where we are going to challenge the all final products definition. We cannot find that in 1494. We cannot find it in anything else. And while we appreciate the intent, we believe the statute is more flexible than that, in that as long as you test at some stage prior to final product, show a certificate of analysis, chain of custody, we believe that's the right way. Otherwise, it's going to kill our edible industry. So with the exception of the reference to final products, I'm fine with that, but I do take exception, and we are going to raise that.
I would wish we don't call it the Steve Baker interpretation. This is interpretations that are coming from attorneys and everybody else. But anyways, going back to this, we have personally contacted Agilent and Shimadzu, and we have visited one of our labs that is currently running a Oregon list, and methylparathion is not an issue. And we actually went into, I don't know if George wants to address this, but it wasn't a column issue, I believe, and it's fixable what was going on there. So this is, in our opinion, is not an issue with methylparathion to do this with one column.
We have no problem running it with the same list. So.
It's going to be in the mix anyhow, so the labs are going to have to test it. They're going to have to make a count for it anyhow. It's coming off, it's giving data, it's part of the Oregon list, it works, it should be fine.
So I'm comfortable revising or reasserting my motion to that products must be tested for pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and growth regulators listed in Table 2 within the Oregon Health Authority's technical report. Products at or below the values listed in the table may be sold.
Okay, and if you all will bear with me, I'm going to try and capture these motions. This is a clunky thing, just so you can see exactly the text, and this is for the purposes of our final report. Sorry.
So if this is for the final report, I'm going to make a motion to strike the word final.
That was, I just said all products, yeah. I'll agree with that.
Okay, so we have a motion right now for all products. I will note, we have had legal interpretation on it that does interpret final products, but that doesn't change the motion that the council
Right,
makes.
and we're going to ask to have a more discussion if possible. I wouldn't fuss about this if it wasn't huge. I'm just going to make this real quick statement. I feel a lot of responsibility here to get this right. We all worry about what happened in Oregon.
You know, I'm one of several people here at this table who are deeply immersed in the edible side of things, and the testing protocols that we pick here might be fine for flower, but they won't always necessarily apply as well to edibles. We do not have the same volume of products. We have different kinds of margins. I'm going to make an argument later, but about why we should allow it to test at different stages. But fundamentally, you know, I've watched as this committee's developed, and for me, I feel a lot of responsibility here to try to make this case. I don't want it on me or this committee if we misstep. So I'm just coming at you from the standpoint of really feeling strongly about trying to get this right.
Isn't all products going to make it worse for you? Now we're talking about the flour, the concentrate, the edible, versus all final product was just the edible. Now we're talking about 3 tests versus 1.
No, because it depends, again, it'll come back to legal, and so it depends on your definition of final.
But you're talking about all products now. That's
Right.
the motion on the table now. All products means your flour, your concentrate, and then your edible.
For me, from my perspective, the product is the end product. So if a grower grows flour, they
product. Yeah, I agree.
Well, we'll get to the terminology. I'm not sure final is the right here. Finished product is the word I'm most worried about.
Or all products ready for sale, or products going to be sold.
Any products that are provided to a consumer must show testing. That's the bottom line. Where that testing is done. In other words, if I buy flour from Steve, and I test that flour, and I know there's no pesticides, and I know there's no solvents, because it's, and I use it for something. If I choose to make a concentrate, I'm going to have to test for solvents. But if I just resell that flour, I should have the chain of custody and the certificate analysis from Steve to say that's what came with that. If he makes concentrate out of that flour, I need to see test data of either the flour and the concentrate or the concentrate. Because that's what I'm going to go on. And if that doesn't reflect any pesticides or solvents, why would I test for that at the final edible stage as well?
Well, if you're going to take a flour and concentrate it down, you're going to see pesticides likely because it's concentrated
This is a
form.
question for you. So, if I see no signal for pesticide, if I see zero signal, does that mean there's none there?
Well, with the flour product, it could be a low amount of pesticides, but once it's been concentrated down with a lot of that batch of flour, then we may pick up pesticides.
So I understand the theory, but so you're telling me that you can get no signal below the level of quantification and still have it appear in a concentrate?
Yes.
Okay, so that would argue for testing at the concentrate stage if that can happen. But my view, and I think a lot of edible manufacturers are going to feel the same way, we have to be mindful of what we test. I've already tried to make the case that this will increase the cost for us by a factor of 9 times, almost 10 times the cost of testing. Now, we'll test as we need to, but I don't want to destroy our market in the process. This will have the effect, given the sizes of batches that edible manufacturers produce, putting them out of business. Because we just don't make the batch sizes, that some states do, or you do with flour concentrate. We're talking a yield of 1,000 or something like that. So when you look at the cost of the additional testing, you fold into it wholesale uplift and a retail uplift, it's a 20% increase minimum.
What if we put finished back in, but we say must have been tested? So that leaves some flexible room that at some point in the chain it was tested for these things. Must have been.
My issue, Jessica, is finished product implies final tested product. So and that's what I worry about, Steve.
So, Hope Jones Laboratory Scientist, I understand completely where you're coming from. I think in this case, though, because pesticides have been shown and are known to become concentrated, so even though they are below a limit of detection or quantitation as flour, once it's been concentrated, though, that final concentrated product, in my opinion, needs to be tested. So even if you have flour that's gone through pesticide analysis, and I would say if I was buying wholesale, as a wholesale purchaser, I would require a COA before I made the purchase, just to know that I'm starting with good, clean stock material, but it still is going to be on me as I process that flour to do a final pesticide analysis, and that is because we know that it concentrates, and we will see that at higher levels. So I do think that we should leave all finished or final product in the wording for the motion on the table right now, which is specific to pesticides.
Let me ask you, Hope, Murray's issue is, he makes the edibles, so he's not, arguing the concentrate facts. So when it comes to just edibles, do you have a concern, do you find a lot of pesticide, fungicide, herbicides in edibles?
Yes.
recently? So,
Yes.
But what if
Especially, for example, Eagle 20.
But if the concentrate is tested first, before it's put into the edible and it's approved, then the edible should therefore be fine, especially if the mass is larger.
So Jay, your point is, I agree with your point, which is if the concentrate was tested before it was made into an edible, that would be a single test, and I would agree with that. So can you make a recommendation how you would word that?
Well, before you do, I've got one other consideration.
And I appreciate the opportunity to just touch on this, because not everyone understands where things come from. In fact, in my presentation, I included a chart showing edibles, concentrates, and infused products, and what the path might be in those cases for what tests would be performed at each stage, just to try to make the visual point that if I've tested my concentrate for everything I need to, pesticides, et cetera, when I make my edible from it, I shouldn't, in my view, have to test for pesticides, heavy metals, or solvent.
Excuse me. So I'm sorry, could you go back to the wording? So then maybe what we could say would be flour and concentrate should be so all flour and concentrate must be tested for pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and growth regulators.
I think we can articulate it a little better, because it would be flour designated for retail sale. Because if the flour's not designated for retail sale, why waste the money on the test? Because it's going to be turned into concentrate, and then we'll test it after concentrate.
Sure.
Right, so then we're back to all final products though, right? Because if we're just saying flour must be tested, then somebody else can.
Final flour and concentrate products, or all finished flour and concentrate products.
Yeah, but that still doesn't get to where we need to be.
Must have been tested for pesticides. fungicides,
You're the attorney.
herbicides.
If you're
What do you
going
think?
to be testing the concentrate going into the edible, that has to be clear, right? That can't be hot. At that point, you shouldn't have to, if the concentrates have been deemed safe, free of pesticides, you shouldn't have to do another pesticide analysis.
That's exactly right. Now, just as I was going to say earlier, we do use whole flour to make certain products, specifically our topicals. And in that case, there's no concentration. We don't use solvents. It's essentially putting it into base oils, and they pull out the cannabinoids. So if there's pesticides in there, I'm going to look at the pesticide data from my flour provider and hope that I didn't see any, since I know concentrate. What are you arguing for here? Are you that I should go ahead and test those topical products for pesticides as well?
So I would actually argue that just because you are doing a solvent extraction, that it doesn't concentrate. So when we're looking at flour, which is fresh or dry weight, compared to when you do a solvent extraction, technically you are still concentrating it, because you have it's based off of weight. So you have a different weight, so you are having, so I would say that extract needs to be tested for pesticide, even though you don't have any trace amounts in your hypothetical of the pesticides. So I would say that yes, it would need to be tested.
So then, can we say all final products must have been tested for pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, growth regulators? However, products which have used a previously tested and passed concentrate may be exempt?
Or retail marijuana, flour, trim, and concentrates must have been tested for pesticides, fungicides, herbicides.
Yeah, that still doesn't get us to where we need to be.
Well, you may require separate motions.
Can't be so vague.
So, yeah, I think what Murray just said, this may require separate motions. I understand why it's tenuous not to have separate motions, like you want it all in one because you don't want to apply one thing and then pass another motion of, recommending a different legal interpretation or reconsideration of what, final product is or that, but you may need to, your point is that basically everything's got to be tested for pesticides. Now, what stage that testing happens is what's up for discussion now, but you want to get across that this testing has to happen on some form of a final product.
So could we actually, piggybacking on Ryan, so this is going to go back to Ryan here. So could it be edibles, final edible products also need to be tested unless made with a concentrate that was,
That's prohibited statement.
I mean, that's kind of what you,
It would be.
but you're specific,
Products too, like topicals would be fine as well, right?
so other products made from concentrates? So is there a better way to word that?
I think your point is maybe we should do this in a separate motion right after the first motion.
We certainly can if.
And
Yeah.
And before you do that, I have one comment to correct this. So, the Oregon list doesn't have any herbicides, so we would have to say pesticide, fungicides, and growth rate regulators listed in the Oregon list or whatever, plus at least one herbicide. Because right now, the statute says we have to do an herbicide.
Well, the statute may say that, but that doesn't have to be our recommendation, does it?
Oh, well, that's reality that we'll have to do. Unless there's some kind of statute change right now.
Huh?
Probably won't get rid of that one, just because.
Well, that's right, but it doesn't have to be in our,
You're right, it does not have to be in the
Recommendation.
That's true.
But for full disclosure, the department will have to add an herbicide in rule.
So you might want to take it out here so it's cleaner.
that's fine, I'll take,
What's that?
The likelihood of that statute change.
I heard it's maybe not as robust as it used to be. So, I will have to see.
We're in a position as this committee, in as much that we're going to exist after the first of the year, to
Come up with a short list of changes that we need to see made to the statute. Who's in a better position to make recommendations to the state as to how to make this better? So if we do that, then, I don't know about how the lobbyist game or state house game works, but somebody at this table will, and we just work it.
so I'll take herbicides out of the motion then, and then I would say that this is subject to a secondary motion
Are we
here.
going to qualify this to be flower trim and concentrate, or?
I think we thought it would be, do this in a separate motion.
So, Ryan, is this your motion as written on the board?
Yes.
Second. We have a motion and a second as written on the slide. All in favor? All opposed? Motion passes, thank you. Let me just make sure this is saved somewhere. Okay.
Okay, so we want to make a second motion then? Yes. So how do we say this?
Pursuant to.
Notwithstanding. You're the lawyer.
Would it be helpful, I'm sorry to interrupt, as you were thinking through this, would it be helpful to pull up the slide that Maria submitted that has that flow chart on it as you're discussing this?
Probably, yeah. I would say notwithstanding any other recommendation or rule, if a final product is made with concentrate or flour that, no, because if it can't be flour, because if you concentrate,
You're right.
it's be made with
It's user discretion.
concentrate, well, that's the same thing, isn't it? That has previously passed testing.
I would say something along the lines of any edible or infused product that has, made from concentrate, that has previously passed, and then fill in the test, pesticides, heavy metals, solvents, et cetera, receives a waiver or whatever for testing at final stage.
Edible, topical.
I said edible and infused. Is that sufficient? I did. Is exempt from further testing.
Flour in the beginning, if you're going to be making it into concentrate, not having to test your flour first.
Well, no, because it would have, yeah, it's not a final product in an edible thing. It would go through, but it would be tested. So in other words, I couldn't make a topical with flour without having tested the flour. And then I'm going to have to go ahead and perform additional tests for topicals where concentration could be a consideration.
Are you going to do potency at the end for final product?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're just waiving these, okay.
Correct.
Understood.
So I'll put this on a slide, that's bigger so everyone can read it. I just didn't know if anyone wanted to look at this first, or do you want me to throw the motion on the slide so we can wordsmith it?
Throw the motion on.
Okay.
Do we want to call this the Baker resolution?
No. I don't mind having a product named after me, but not the interpretation.
We're going to name the strain after you.
I wonder, I mean, should we limit this? It seems like we're talking about this in the context of pesticides. I don't know that this makes sense to exempt from like the other tests that we do, right? By like microbial, for example.
Microbial would be a necessary.
Microbial, we definitely support at final stage. Potency goes without saying. This is really about solvents, heavy metals, and pesticides.
Yeah. And the aspergillus is only on the inhalables, which would be also final product.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
So does the word concentrate in there encompass butters and other oils that they would use to make the flour directly?
Yeah.
Any preparation.
Maybe we put made from flour or concentrate.
Because again, if it's flour, then it would concentrate during the process. That's the problem.
So when you say past testing, I noticed that,
Final,
well, I'm trying to get the definition of what past testing. So on the slide that Murray had, it said less than the LOQ at the bottom. Are we talking about the safety limit now or the LOQ? The LOQ should be half the safety limit according to Oregon. That's how they set their limits. So those are two different things here.
I think from what I've heard from Hope, it sounds like that bulleted item at the bottom is really not relevant, since we're going to have to test for any concentrated pesticides or heavy metals at the concentrate stage.
So we might then add in safety, past the safety limit.
Testing first.
That's the. That's safe.
Is what I'm hearing?
Yep.
Does that address your concerns?
Yep.
I make a motion that what's posted on the board, any edible or infused product made from concentrate that has previously passed safety testing is exempt from final testing for solvents, heavy metals and pesticides, fungicides, and growth regulators.
Second.
All in favor? All opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Okay, so we are, let's see. So we finished the pesticides piece, and now we're gonna move into sample collection and storage, and all the other good stuff, and we would love to get some motions out of this today to close out the final report. So, we talked about the finished products only, and council's now made some recommendations related to that. This is just some stuff that we had thrown out there before, and Steve talked about last week about sampling plan SOPs and representative samples, that kind of thing. We also had some member recommendations that we talked about at a previous meeting related to sampling plans based on Colorado regulations, and those are included in the slides. And then I have a mix of slides from Murray. If you want to talk a little bit about,
Sure.
we did this already, I think.
I can walk through just to
Okay.
reinforce it when
Great.
you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So, thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity to just touch on this. Some of this content that you'll see is, you've previously looked at from the Oregon model that we were previously shown. We wanted to make the point on this slide that we've gone through 1494, and we couldn't find any reference to the test stage. And we appreciate Steve's point about this is what the lawyers say, but we really have to argue that it's contrary to what other states are doing, and it's just not practical. So we're going to ask for an interpretation or whatever the formal way is to do that and try to make the case for that. And that's why we made the motions earlier. So we think processing stage is a relevant thing, and that's where we come to flour versus concentrate in terms of what's happened there and what gets used in the final product. We mentioned a complete portfolio. They'll need to provide the full set of test data for every processing state in terms of meeting this. So I basically showed on the next slide, Jessica, just the Oregon product type testing. Now this is just a clean version of the one that was placed and shown to us earlier. All I did was take the bottom bullet at the very bottom and pull that out of the sections above. And their asterisks should show up in the extract concentrate column under solvents. And then what we did is we took this somewhat cleaned up model and we changed it slightly to show what we believe Arizona should do. And this represents the testing that would take place at each stage, what would be required, and so on. So that was just intended to take the Oregon model and reflect it. And the next slide was really meant to show you, make the case for if I'm making flour and trim, I'll test for certain things and then I'll sell it. If I'm going to make that flour and trim and I'm going to turn it into concentrates, then I'm going to analyze for certain things at the pre-stage. Now, this might argue, if your goal is to take flour and trim and simply extract it, to not test for pesticides and heavy metals at a flour stage, but rather test that after the extraction stage. It's immaterial to us as long as we don't have to test for it at the edible infusion stage. So again, flour and trim can, in the bottom, be analyzed for pesticides and heavy metals and then become an infused product. In this case, it would be a topical product, and then go on to retail sale after final potency testing and micro. I then go on to mention a few things about sample size. We're very concerned about sample size. I know we're going to get a presentation on ANSI sampling. We examined the ANSI sampling practices and found that they're prohibitive for edibles. The number of tests or samples we would have to test on, say, 1,000 unit batch would be on the order of, say, 80. And when you look at the cost of that in testing, it becomes pretty expensive. We believe that there are better models, but require formal practices in terms of how you do your sampling to ensure homogeneity and reasonable sampling. And we would look toward these other federal standards or the practices that they encourage to do that. You can step next. So sampling and remediation practices, these are just, again, referring to Colorado, which has been previously done. And in the sample sizes, we don't take any particular issues with any of these sample size plans. Next. And then Tiffany.
And you had some other slides, I think I moved to a different section, but they're still in our slide set.
Good. So one of them is a member recommendation on remediation, but we can touch on that. We're in pretty much the same place as most folks. You can remediate for certain things and not for others.
Yeah, I just want to add that, I think that flow chart, we captured the vast majority of it in your second motion, I think, right? The intent of it. And I'm reading the statute right here, and it just says, before selling or dispensing products, the dispensaries shall test marijuana and marijuana products for medical use to determine unsafe levels of microbial contamination, heavy metals, and pesticides. I don't see that as inconsistent with our secondary motion. The secondary motion ensures that all products are tested for all things as safety, just with the knowledge that, pesticides aren't going to be added after the fact into an edible product. So I don't think that our motion is inconsistent with the statute.
I will add that if the state has concerns over this, then, let us perform control studies or process validations and, provide those to the state to show you how we do things in detail. And we'd be happy to do that. If the rest of us here don't see the FDA and the DEA and everybody else with 3 letters coming after us in the next 5 years to regulate the heck out of us, then you're not paying attention. And this is all prep for that, really.
I don't think we have concerns over if it's split into different parts for the testing. I think the concern was, is there flexibility there? That's what the concern was. It wasn't in the current way it's written, so.
Yeah, we appreciate the motion that was made and this flow chart and that Oregon uses this as a standard. It makes sense. Sometimes we get confined with what's written in the statute. We will continue to take it back and take a look at it as we're drafting the rule to see if there's any flexibility that we can determine in there.
The one thing I would ask is, so if I'm a patient and I walk into a dispensary, I buy Steve, or, that's my product. So how are you going to assure that you have the results from different points of testing that are going to be on that final report?
Well, that's part of our formal process.
Okay.
COAs have a QR code. At least most labs are using it's not really a LIMS, but it's kind of like a LIMS, but it is.
Confident Cannabis?
Yes, and actually it's been very robust. So the COAs have those QR codes. Some companies actually are putting those QR codes on the packaging as a sticker, so then they can actually use the phone to scan and get directly to the full COA. And it was going to be something that I looked forward to recommending as well, to have at least that traceability. So there's not aspects of dry labbing or any other fraudulent use of other COAs not linked to a specific batch.
So we'll have to make sure that the report that's given to because what I was looking at is the lab is going to give a technical report, which will have all the parts that they've tested for. So are you saying that the dispensary is going to put together the certificate of a...
Produced by the labs, and then
that report from Cannabis is not ISO accredited. Can't use that, doesn't have the criteria on it that meets ISO requirements for reporting.
So I think that Confident Cannabis, the last I spoke with them anyway, are working with ISO in Oregon with ISO accredited labs and ORAC to meet those standards. So that would, I think, require follow-up.
There's certain ways you can pay them to add to that.
Yeah.
But right now, as is, they're not, the ones here aren't ISO.
And most of the time it's because of it's the safety of the lab perspective, right? Because of the potential for hackability and the integrity of the storage of the data on the cloud. So that's why it's not technically a full LIMS, but it does have the trackability, and I think that if we gave the okay that this has been demonstrated, at least as an example of a software used by labs in multiple states, including Oregon, which is the ORLAP states, and it seems to be, it produces as well as the track and trace in Arizona and other states, right? I mean, everything is hackable, and there are problems with everything. But I think if we require an official LIMS of the state for the labs to use, those are tens and tens of thousands of dollars additional costs.
Well, why is there a requirement for LIMS or anything else? I mean, and why is there an ISO requirement for the testing itself?
ISO requires a LIMS system.
But ISO for the lab.
Right.
But there's no requirement on part of the state that I provide an ISO compliant testing data, is it? So, and we'll come back.
And then we'd have to issue an additional report if you wanted something like Confident Cannabis. That's like 2 reports.
The
answer is the labs generate the reports that are given to the customer. So if the customer is the
Right.
state, then the state gets that report. And it could be a report that's generated by the laboratory, or it could be a report that's generated by the laboratory that uses a LIMS or Confident Cannabis. But either way, it's the labs that put
Okay.
together that report, that give it to the customer.
Right.
Because
And then-
that's what I gotta write in the regs, is how that's gonna happen, because if you're going to do testing of pesticides, metals, and solvents at a earlier stage, that's gonna be not, possibly out of sync with the final testing.
You're going to have two
in my
COAs. You're going to have one for the finished product where you've got the potency and the microbial, and you're going to have a second one that's from the concentrate that was used to make it. So there would actually be two COAs assigned to that, and therefore 2 QR codes. You know, I think I speak for dispensaries when I say we're going to be pretty insistent on receiving Confident Cannabis reports. That's going to be a necessity. Now, I know the state needs more detail, but we're going to want...
Because that's a company.
I understand. We're going to ask for that kind of report that we can point at the web and
I'm
download.
sorry, I'm gonna cut this conversation here at this point. We had a motion related to reporting last week. It was that a technical report was required to be produced from a laboratory. The industry can certainly drive additional reports that they'd like, but that's not something the department will be writing into rule at this time. But I'd wanna make sure that we revisit the sample collection pieces and go through some of the sampling things, because we really need to make sure we get that into the report. Tiffany, there you go. Come on up. You can sit over there next to George if you'd like. No, there's a seat right next to you. On the other side, around the corner. And then is there a mic by Vince? Thank you. Okay. And I'll click through your slides. You just
like
prompt me.
wave?
Yeah, whatever you
Okay.
want. You can make a ding like the old school film strips, whatever works.
All right, well, we can go, I guess. You guys can hear me okay? Closer to my face, okay. The next one. You guys, I'm Tiffany, hello. So I broke it into 3 parts. One, to go over the method, which it sounds like some people are already aware of. 2, to look at the existing state methods, which use modified AQLs in most instances. And then 3, to go over what the current sample size requirement is for the labs that are here that are publicly available on Confident Cannabis. Okay, if you'll move forward. So the cool part about this is this has been going on for 100 years. This is not new. I'm not trying to sell you guys something crazy. This has been here. First got started in 1918. The table that will be presented later is from the 1930s. It has been the same since then. There's no change there. These are used across many industries and used effectively in larger companies inside the cannabis industry and many multi-state operators. Above and beyond that, the reason we do this is so that we can have confidence that the sampling we're doing is both creating a homogeneous sample and that sample that we've taken is going to provide us the knowledge and information that each individual batch is safe for patients. It's kind of a big deal for me, right, as a patient. I'm sure it is for all the other patients in the room. So if we use these 2 things and then we say that all of the patient safety testing that we're recommending would be critical defects, meaning if we didn't pass whatever limits you guys set, the batch would then not be sellable or would have to be remediated, however you guys determine that would be, then we would be aligned with the international standard for how sampling and inspection works using this method. If we could go to the next. So here are the tables. Again, these are from the 30s, okay? It's pretty easy to determine how to use them. Some of us have used them for a long time. You first decide what your general inspection level is going to be. So in this case, I said in the first slide that we saw, we would go with general inspection level 2. General inspection level 2 is the standard. If you go to a 1, it is more flexible. If you go to a 3, it is tight. If you have a super small batch size, so less than 100 units, there are special inspection levels that will also change how many samples you have to take and inspect so you're not doing destructive testing across your whole batch. You then take that information, it tells you what your lot size is. So let's say you're creating 10,000 1 gram units of something. You could go to 10,000. And it's going to say, okay, you're going to go to line item L on the next table over. Or if you said, hey, I'm going to make, 100 units of something. So I'm making a smaller batch. You would go from 91 to 150, and it would tell you to go to F. If you went to the following table, you would note that F and L actually have the same accept limits, right? So even though you would have potentially more units to inspect, so more samples to take, your actual requirement for what passes is the same. So it is impacted by the batch size, but it's not.
Quick question, Stephanie. So the table on the left, is this the level 2 standard table?
It is.
Okay, and then the headings along the X, is that I feel like I'm in an I exam test. But I just want to make sure I understand the tables because it's sounding logical and I want to follow with you. So is that I? Could you explain what those letters are?
Yeah, so I is a loosened inspection criteria. So let's say you've been working with the same company forever and you're a regulator and you're like, they have never had a failing test for 5 years. I'm comfortable they can do like less stringent testing.
Okay.
And then you have 2, which is II, and that's just normal for everyone. That gives us 95% confidence that we're correct, that we've sampled correctly in general. And then you have 3, which is, wow, I have a bad actor. This is someone who is routinely doing something that doesn't work. That I'm often getting test results that would be considered failing if they were, trying to put something into the commercial marketplace.
Explain that. Those are really important points.
Okay. And then special inspection levels are really specific for small batch sizes. This is when you have to do an inspection, but maybe you only make 50 units. Okay? And those 50 units, if you destroy them, that would destroy, I don't know, $1 million worth of stuff. Right? So there's an entire ISO standard for this that goes into all of this, and it's like 360 pages. So this is a very broad overview.
So does this address the issue with the smaller batches and the number of samples required?
It does.
So I was using an example of, say, 1,000 brownies.
Yeah.
In your model, I mean, when I look at this, I'm going to find myself over on J, I think, or G, excuse me, and I'm going to go to the table. No, J, pardon me. I'm going to go over to the table, and J's going to push me over into 80 samples.
This is correct. So if we could go to the next slide, this may help. Okay, so let's discuss the different batch sizes. So in this case, you would define what your units are. So let's say you make 100 brownies, okay? You're going to have to define what your unit is. Maybe your 100 brownies go into, 10 brownie packs, or maybe they go into individual brownie packs, okay? And maybe each individual brownie weighs 1,000 grams, and you put all 100 brownies, and now you have 100,000 grams, and you have to collect a portion of the batch you're making, okay? And that's your sample size. Now, that sample size is not what gets submitted for testing. That's where you are collecting the sample across all of the units, okay? And you're saying, I have inspected the unit for things like visual defects, and it wasn't, it wasn't discolored, it didn't smell weird, it didn't have like bugs sticking out of it, whatever it is. And then you say, okay, now I have to create the amount that the testing lab needs. And you use a process called quartering to define that. So you make a pile of stuff. So in this case, you can make a pile of brownies. Hopefully they're packaged. Okay, you make a pile of brownies, and then you make that into four smaller piles. Then you take 2 of the smaller piles, and you mix those together. And then you make another stack of 4. And then until you get to the point where it says, hey, how much does your lab need to test all of the things? I have a slide for that. But let's say you need 8 grams of material to do that test, and your brownie weighs 20 grams. You may actually end up with only 1 brownie, but you've randomized where the brownie came from, so the amount that you're actually submitting is less. Or if you actually are creating really, really tiny brownies, or, I don't know, gummy bears or something, you may be actually taking 1 out of each package to create that sample size that actually gets submitted for testing. So the destructive part of the ANSI AQL is less than the amount that you actually pull as a sample to inspect.
Can you tell me the general inspection limits again? how they fall in, how would you fall into 1, 2, or 3?
Yeah, so one is you're low risk, right? So you've been doing this for a while. You're a vendor perhaps, and you're, purchasing from a vendor, and you're testing their stuff routinely, and they pass, the last 20 times with flying
The
colors.
state would decide if you're a 1, 2, or 3 based on
Correct.
history.
Based on risk, yes. Or they just say, we don't care about risk, everyone's going to do the same thing always, and it would be the middle item. That's how the standard is written.
2, okay.
Okay. So in this case, if you continue to go up in units, and you define the units, right? And of course, the regulator gets to say whether or not they agree with your unit definition. But you define the units. So let's say you have a 100-pound batch, and it's in 5-pound totes. Maybe it's only 20 units. Well, that's how large of your batch it is. It's a 20-unit batch. So then instead of going for 100, you're going to go for 20 on the table, and you'll inspect the number of units. You can inspect the unit itself. So for instance, if you made gummy bears, and your batch of gummy bears is 100,000 gummy bears, but you actually package them into 100-pound packs, it's 1,000 units. Does that? Okay.
We do need to be a little careful about the term batch here. The state has a very specific definition of batch, and it is not the same as everywhere else. And I know there's going to be conversation later about batch versus lot, so we need to get clarity on that language.
In the ANSI table, it uses the word lot. So, and I come from an industry where they're interchangeable, but
They randomly throw batches and lots around as the same.
Right.
They're used interchangeably and
We need to clarify exactly batch or lot.
or add new terms like production batch if appropriate. You did have one error on here on second bullet, 10 pounds. I think you mean 10 units.
yeah, it should be 10 units there. Or 2-pound packages. Either or would work. If you can go to the next one. Okay, so if we look here and we say, hey, we're going to do this 20-pound batch with 1-pound packages using the general inspection level, we would have a sample size letter C, which would mean we would then sample 5 units. So you would go to your units, in this case, your unit packages, or your pre-packs, or your totes, or however we're doing it. This is a flour example. And you're going to do a top, middle, bottom for each container and combine it, and then mix the samples together, and then use the quartering method that I discussed before. And then you'll select the sample requirement, the testing sample requirement, that is needed to satisfy the lab's requirements. Again, because we could say that it only requires half a gram to do the testing, but then we would be forcing the labs to do something that's physically impossible. And then I think there was also something that you guys had put in your slides, whether or not you actually have motioned for it, I don't know, I'm not actually a part of this stuff, where you discussed whether it would be taken in triplicate or duplicate specific to retaining things in case of failures and allowing additional testing. So you would take that sample all at the same time. Okay, we can go to the next. So if we look at Colorado, which is actually in some cases a little bit more than what would be required from an ANSI AQL, depending on the size, which is always by weight, which always confuses me, given that, 100 pounds of edibles, I don't even know how big that would be. I think, how big is that? It would be big, depending on like what the edible is made out of, I suppose. Brownie's probably way more than, I don't know, some other non-brownie tastiness. So in the same way, they require in Colorado that you do sample collection in a stratified manner, top, middle, bottom, in a star pattern. They actually have in their standard pictures of how to do it and create the star pattern that's top, middle, and bottom. It's present. So if you had to ask, if you were interested in what I mean when I say this, they have a really good diagram. Okay. We can go to the next one. And then we have other places which might be more stringent, okay, where we would say, hey, in Nevada, you're always going to take 1% of the product weight or more. And the minimum batch size would be 5 grams. So, again, what would the 5 grams be? Is it the usable marijuana that's 5 grams? I mean, that's what it says. So if you had edibles that only had 10 milligrams in them, I think that's, 500 edibles that have to be submitted every time or something crazy like that, if I was interpreting it correctly. No sampling method here is defined. I have no idea how they managed to get it done, but they do in this case. If you can, to the next. And then you have Massachusetts, which, as far as I could tell, was using the old N+1 method, which works. It's from pharma, and the batch sizes are much larger. Millions of tablets, not thousands of brownies or tens of brownies. And in this case, they specifically say that the sample size itself is not defined, but they do still use top, middle, bottom, and cording is called for. The number of containers to be sampled is specific to units, which I've been talking about before, so it doesn't matter how big the batch is necessarily, it's how many finished product packaged units you would look at based on your lot size. And then followed on by saying, hey, you must create this homogeneous sample using quartering, mixing, stirring, grinding, and quartering. So it has a different standard for each type, whether it's flour, concentrates, or other materials like edibles.
That's why I'm thinking about it. I just want to address the issue with something that you just said that made me think about it. The non-medicated components of a medible, nuts, M&Ms, coconut, you name it. When we're homogenized, it causes a bias low because you have non-medicated product in there. That's something to consider too, because the lab's not going to wipe all that stuff off every time. A lot of it's immersed into the product as well. So we get a lot of times a cookie brownie, oh, it's low. Well, look at all the coconut, nuts, M&Ms you had in it, and we homogenized the entire product and took a aliquot of that to sample. So just want to keep that in mind too with non-medicated products of any finished product.
Yeah, and as an edible manufacturer, we believe you have to make allowances for that in terms of how you dose, so that the testing results reflect the actual values of the entire product.
So we're good for the next one. So here what I've done is I went in Confident Cannabis as and just pulled out, this is how much based on what I believe you guys have already voted as testing that needs to be necessary. In some cases, I think terpenes, you said, maybe doesn't have to be performed, but all of the labs appear to do this testing as a single sample that can be submitted. And I just said, hey, here's 5 labs that were the first 5 that were on the list from Confident Cannabis, and this is how much it cost in terms of weight that you submit to get the testing done. And so if you kind of go through there and you say, okay, well, 3 of them need at least 8 grams. So then I said, okay, well, if 3 of them need 8 grams, and those ones are going to still be doing the activities, then we probably need to give everyone at least 8 grams to do the work. You can go to the next. What I was recommending, based on all of this information, is that we go with a general inspection level 2. We use the number of containers per batch to set the lot size. So you guys define your batch and your number of containers, whether it's baggies or totes or super sacks or whatever it happens to be. Define that. Utilize top, middle, bottom, star pattern, or a sample thief to perform the sampling. Create a composite. Get to quartering so that you arrive at the most homogeneous sample possible. And then take a minimum sample size of 24 grams to allow the duplicate testing, which is listed in case of remediation or failed, and to maintain or retain in case additional testing is necessary. So in this case, 8 grams would get tested, 8 grams would hang out in case you wanted to do additional testing, and then I guess you do whatever you want with it, and then 8 grams would hang out and set in case a regulator asks you a question.
I'm sorry, can we go back to the one slide? So I just wanted to clarify, at least in my understanding, so the 1 gram, so just looking at the 8 grams, so the same, just to use a flour for example, 1 gram flour can also be used for the pesticides. So it's just that if you're submitting 1 sample and it's a flour, you need to provide a gram, not for each one of those tests.
We do individually.
That would be ideal, but I just wanted to point out that that's not always the case, because they take a little piece, they can take a little piece off of the flour and do the terps and the potency. They could also take, so I just wanted to make sure that we were clear that that's not necessarily always how it's represented. So if
if we wanted it to be less and make sure all of the labs have enough to do so this is just what they say currently that they need. If you say, I want potency, terps, pesticides, heavy metals, water activity, micro testing.
And then microbial doesn't even, it goes straight to the micro department before it wouldn't even go near the other areas. So we definitely have to keep that segregated, and no one touches the bag until that's been done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Just wanted to
so,
clarify that.
so if the labs, right, because I'm not a lab. If the labs want to say that really we only need 5 grams and it needs to come in, 1 gram, 1 gram, and 2 grams, and we're good.
I mean, that's enough to get a good homogeneous sample, because we crush it ourselves. I mean, if you give us any less than that, I mean, we could go with a little, we only weigh out 50 milligram to 100 milligram or whatever, a little bit more sometimes in some cases, but we need that much to get a good representative sample, especially when the trichomes are all over the place in the product packaging.
The process is, I mean, when you consider the number of samples you're not just going to get next year, but after rec happens, you're going to want those samples to come to you as organized a fashion as possible. 1 gram increments, separately labeled, the whole 9 yards, otherwise you're going to go nuts.
Amen.
Well, let's hope
And
they come
also,
in that way.
the cost of those extra 2 grams, that doesn't begin to concern me as much as the cost of that heavy metals test you're going to hit me with. That's what's expensive.
It is expensive.
The last slide is just, do you guys have questions? I don't know how many people have done this before, and so I'm making a recommendation based off my 17 years working in pharma, 5 years working in cannabis, starting in Colorado, going to Massachusetts, and now here in Arizona. So this is me saying, what more information do you need specific to sampling? Are there any definitions that I didn't provide? Does the method make sense so you guys can think on it? Do you need anything more?
So, a very good presentation and well delivered, so we could all understand it too on your delivery, Tiffany. That was really, really helpful. I liked it better than my recommendation. So, but I wanted to see on bullet 2. It actually sets up for, in my mind, a nice understanding of batch versus lot, and I wanted to see what the group thought about that, because that gets into our definition.
So I think Marie, you'd mentioned there's a specific definition of batch, right? And that is, I believe it's based on harvest date, right?
Correct, harvest.
So,
Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't think necessarily batch should be required to be harvest same day, because oftentimes it could be the same room could be harvested within 48 hours or 72 hours. So I think we need to have some flexibility in harvest dates, and we can have some discussion back and forth, but I do think that the fact that it's saying, and then set the lot size for the sample set, I thought was a nice way to phrase that.
Just to be clear, state defines a batch as a harvest batch planted and harvested at the same time.
And these are definitions that are in our current rules.
batch means a specific lot of medical marijuana grown from 1 or more seeds or cuttings that are planted and harvested at the same time.
Shouldn't it be strain specific?
Turns out it's
It's not.
Yes, it should be, but it's not.
So then we would take that, so you're saying, Hope, we use a different word here, so for example, production batch?
Production batch would be the term we would use, yeah.
Well, for edibles, you would use production batch, but let's look at, let's talk if we were just selling flour. We need to look at it if we were just selling flour instead of just making an edible here.
Right, but wouldn't a production batch still be the amount of product you produce? It might be equivalent to a harvest batch.
Yeah. Here we go, getting tricky again with our wording.
Well,
No, you're-
the state
It's
defined
needed,
the terminology, and unless we want to get cross for ourselves, we've got to.
No, yeah, you're 100% correct. I th-
So before getting into the details of the definition, I guess I'd like the council to consider in general if this approach is something that you, I'm not asking for a vote at this minute, but that you're in favor of, or if you want to discuss a different approach. And then from there, maybe it'd be good to talk about wordsmithing and defining it.
I like this approach myself.
This is a very, obviously, a well-established, peer-reviewed, factual, program that's been put into place since 1918, and clearly it makes sense.
Tiffany, is this something you guys are doing now?
Yeah.
And it's been
Yeah.
working for you?
Yes, so it's, as a director of quality, when I came, I said, hey, we should be doing this. I want to be certain as is statistically possible in an uncertain world, that what we're doing is correct. We already do all of the testing that's listed here, plus some testing that's not listed here, before anything leaves our facility, and that's flour, trim, edibles, concentrates, cartridges, tincture, lozenges, and derms. Anything that leaves our facility already has this, and we use this method to do that.
So is it safe to say that within your own facility, you'll have a quality assurance program and dedicated staff to that?
I do, there's 18 of us.
Okay.
Obviously,
But a lot
we're
of
pretty
people
big.
don't. You know, just within the kitchens, they kind of pick it out. I was
Charging
just
so
wondering,
much for
because
your
it would take an
flour,
army to
all
make
this
sure
staff.
all that happened according to this, which is good.
Start charging more. Don't do that.
It's size dependent, so I think depending on, as you scale up, you're right, it does get to that army size,
There's a
but
lot
it's
of- lot of
really,
eyes on it to make sure it's being done right, too.
and it should be.
It's
So
safe to say it'll
I like
arrive
the
at the lab
sampling
all nice and
size.
pretty.
I like this table of qualifying what size samples we take. It makes a lot of sense, and I like how they categorize low-risk, normal business players and then high-risk players. I think that's probably smart. It gives the department an opportunity to identify something you haven't been able to do in the past, is identify bad players versus the exceptional players. So I think that's probably a good thing to have in place.
So I don't know if that's possible that the department would implement, but I do think that for the food industries, for example, they typically set the standards on when you might qualify for a level 1, and that would be based off of typically after 1 year of full compliance. And I think maybe that would be very interesting to entertain because of the ability also to target, to reward those players that are compliant on a regular basis. But as you were speaking to, Steve, those that are constantly problematic should, I think, be scrutinized more heavily because there's something going on. So I don't know if that would be something that if we did adopt this or make a recommendation, if the department would entertain the multi-level option. But I think that this is a very good, robust, well understood approach and method within other industries that have existed for a long time, unlike ours.
It happens all the time in the environmental world, reduced monitoring and everything, but you have a certain amount of time that you're required to follow just the normal testing, and then at some point, if you've shown that you don't have issues, then you can qualify for the reduced testing. That happens all the time in all these industries. We'd have to set up the initial time. We would want all of the products to go through a certain amount of time here from the start.
I was gonna 1 year would be nice, but this is the first year that we're starting it, so I almost think 2 years would be a more appropriate time frame because the first year is going to be a learn curve for everybody, and then obviously if you are compliant the second year, the first and the second year, so if you've been compliant for 2 years, then maybe you qualify.
You might want to also, some people maybe don't do a lot of lots in a year, so you might want to have something that has a time limit plus a lot number, just to make sure you're getting into, through a certain number of lots or.
1,000 tests.
So Tiffany, the fact that you guys have been implementing this, to Steve's points, if there was a number of tests, so if we were to look at a 2-year and a number component, would you have a recommendation of what that number of tests might look like?
Yeah, so I would definitely go at least 2. personally. The seasonal changes are pretty intense. Since I've been here, I've been doing this for Copper State for 9 months. The difference between spring, summer, fall, and now winter has been very intense across the board from everything, from water testing, et cetera. So if I like to call it testing things on trend, and you have to define the trend, and until you get the trend where you have enough data points that you're not seeing huge spikes like every other week. There is a section of the ISO standard that discusses how to note that things are on trend and how to note that when things are out of specification. So you have your two limits. One is, hey, here's a limit that's defined by the regulator, and the other is, here's a limit that's defined by yourself, saying, hey, I usually don't see, I don't know, arsenic, for instance. And
So it might be something that we can't do until we have
establish
data
the trend,
the first year. Okay, so, but at least starting with at the level 2
Yeah.
for the start, and then we can evaluate when we reconvene next year.
I mean, and in
After
Colorado, what
implementation.
is it? 85% of things pass in Colorado?
It sounds like a shall instead of a may.
Yeah, for sure.
Tiffany, how many people do you have doing this with you? Your team, you said about 10 people or so?
So the people who do this specific portion of sampling there's 2.
There's 2.
Yes.
And they can handle the whole thing, the homogenization, the going through the 80 samples, switching them back and forth. Those just 2 people?
Yeah, every day, about 5, between 5 and 7 batches, depending on time of year.
Everybody knows Copper State works our people to death.
Well, I'm still alive.
Murray, would you like to pay a little bit more per pound of flour distillate? 'Cause we'll be happy to arrange for that.
Yeah, so I mean, in a broader world, so they all work less than 45 hours a week. It's batch specific. We schedule around the harvest schedule so that we know that it's going to be batch specific, which can be adjusting of a schedule. But otherwise, I mean, it's 2 people, and they managed on a normal monthly basis. We do between 100 and 200 patient safety sets of samples, and then we have an additional set of potency samples that go out as well.
And you verify their work, so you're responsible for making sure that they're doing it right.
Yes, so I audit that, and I also review all of the results and create the final certificate of analysis.
So we're looking at 3-man teams for everybody, about 100K.
I mean, I don't know how many batches everyone else does, but I mean, I do between 100 and 200 batches a month, so if you're at that same amount, you may also need a team of 3.
Just concerned that, it might need a team of 5 people, that's 150K extra you guys are paying in salaries a year, if not more or less.
But from a safety standpoint, and again, it does depend on the size, I think, of the operation, but I think it's important business that needs to be understood by the dispensaries.
Probably incredibly cheaper than a failure.
Yeah.
Just
Well, the expenses the labs are taking on for more chemists and more instrumentation too.
You're going to have 3 times more people. You're gonna need a lot, yeah.
So, as far as lot and batch, I would put exactly what you think should be up on that, and then we'll work within the department. I talked to we have our rule writer right here. We can talk about if that's gonna work, or we can make it consistent. So I would vote on exactly what you think should be in the motion.
So unless there's further discussion, I'd make a motion that we adopt this with the exception of, we say,
Before you jump in there, I understand, Tiffany, that there's a number of things that ANSI deals with in terms of switching as well. And we haven't talked about some of those other protocols. This, ANSI can be a bit of a, I won't say black hole, let's just say, yeah. And I worry a little bit about the things we're not paying attention to or that we don't know about that might be further down the track. In my view, I'd like time to look at this and study it more before I vote on it. I really feel like the sampling thing is something we need to do right. I will say, in principle, I like what you've done, and you've put some of my mind to rest about the number of units, but I think I'd like to go away and look at this.
I'm not sure we can. So that's maybe you can split it so that you're only voting for a part of ANSI and not the parts you haven't
We are
reviewed.
asking to reconvene in 6 months.
Yeah.
So maybe we could agree on something smaller, like, I don't know if this is it, but personally, I like the star pattern, and I like 1% of the product. So if it's kosher kush, 1% of that, 1% of your GTF, and whatever. But maybe we can find some kind of a compromise in between, and then when we reconvene in 6 and 12 months, we can change that.
We have to get a letter to the governor and the legislature on sampling, so.
So you guys are under a lot of pressure to submit this.
Today is the day to get some recommendations out of the council.
I think we should make a motion.
Maybe a little bit more discussion then. Is 24 grams the appropriate, or 8 grams times 3, is that comfortable for everybody? Does that seem appropriate? Do we need triplicate, or is duplicate enough? Because I don't know that the state is going to be, the DHS as part of the rules is going to ask us to retain a sample for them to test. I don't know. Is that, Steve, I'd like to hear your input on that.
I don't want to get into that necessarily at this point, if we can. The discussion of whether we're going to have a state lab do testing or have the ability to send it off to another laboratory, we have not talked through. So at this point, I wouldn't worry about that as far as the council.
So Tiffany, if that's the case, would a duplicate be sufficient
Yeah.
as opposed to a triplicate? Yeah. So it would be,
Unless you guys aren't going to allow retesting.
Oh, there should be.
I don't know if we already
Remediation,
said.
so.
Yeah.
We need 2 samples.
At least duplicate. And then Tabitha, you said 5 grams you thought is sufficient minimum sample size, or is it 8?
Right now, 8.
Okay. So then I would make a motion that we adopt this as written, except for we use the term production batch, and that the minimum sample size is 16. And I'm open to other suggestions if anybody has.
16 grams
Use
total
production batch.
per.
No, that's the minimum amount per batch, right?
If I have 4 strains that I'm testing,
Well, we're talking about a production batch,
Not a strain.
right?
but I'm going to test them all as if each one is a batch.
How can you do that?
So
when
what
the
would be a
potency
good
level's
word?
gonna be so different between your strains? How can you get a representative number if you're submitting Northern Lights and Blue Dream together in the same batch? Just 'cause you're-
I wouldn't be
don't
doing
have
that.
to
I would be submitting
But
Northern
we
Lights as
wanna
one
have it.
batch, OG Kush is another batch, Granddaddy Perp is another batch, and now I have to give 16 grams of each of those.
But is this articulating that?
The batch
way?
definition didn't define that, that's why I'm asking. That would be on dispensaries and to actually do that because
But
that's.
we
They
can
define
change our
it.
rule, can't we?
Yeah.
They define what
To
the
be
batch
We
is.
would be defining what a production batch is.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or DHS would take it up or define
It's a lot.
definition for that.
Perhaps
Kind
you
of a
can
concern.
separate out the potency grams from everything else.
Yeah.
And in which case you would have a batch, which could be multiple plants, as just
So use
defined
a
there,
different term.
that would be tested for safety. And then you would have the specific label claim requirements, which would be potency or whatever else you're putting on your label.
Each strain is just like each one of us. It gets sick differently and reacts differently. It could have different mold that the other one didn't have.
That's what she's actually specifying, so to have the batches, so we would add a bullet here, I think, where it would state that, I don't know where to put it yet, so let me think. So you're saying, so basically we're testing for potency and we're testing for safety.
Yeah.
And they are separate because the potency can't be combined with multiple different strains if in fact a batch contained multiple strains in a defined production batch. But safety can be from a pesticide, so the whole room, that's why a lot of times we think of it as a production batch or a harvest batch because it was the same environments, typically the same fertilizers, the same feed, the same pesticides, same water, same microbial environments, but the potency will vary, and so
The microbials would still vary because the plants have different, genomic structures. Their personalities. One can get sick easier than the other. You and me could drink the same water all day long, but we'd still grow up different.
but we're just looking for presence. We're not looking for if it's affecting one strain or another. So from a safety perspective, I think the previous motions that we adapted actually address the safety, but the potency, so I guess I'm saying I kind of disagree. So if you were in one open room, we're all being exposed. If there was a virus, airborne virus, we're all being exposed to it equally. And if we can't test every single one of us for the virus, so we have to select a certain batch size to be able to test a representative sample. So I think this addresses a representative sample, but it doesn't directly address that. Really, for a potency, we would only need 2 grams then. So 2 grams for potency, and then, so then it would be 12.
Yeah, that would be yeah, okay. I mean, that would be included in that 16 grams, right?
Well, I guess it would be, yeah. But then just to state, maybe then and break down bullet 2.
So in this gentleman's example, Ryan, it would be 6 grams
Yeah.
times 2, so
Times
12
2.
grams for potency, okay?
Because he's testing 4 different strains.
Right? And then an additional 12 grams, which would be 24 grams for patient safety.
Of the entire
Total,
batch.
which I know it said 24 grams earlier, but that would be an additional 8 grams.
That's just using 4 strands.
Yeah, as an
So
example.
how would you modify this?
I would say the total sample size to be taken would be a minimum of 4 grams of material per production batch for potency, and...
Well, it would be 2 because one, the batch require 1.
Oh, well, so this is for duplicate.
Yeah, we gotta have duplicate, right?
Right.
And 12 grams of material, which is 6 grams times 2 for patient safety. So it's the same amount, it's just separated, and if you had multiple batches that you needed potency information on, this number would go up, which is why the word minimum is there. Yeah.
Does that address your concern, Steve?
Does this take the Colorado sampling plan totally off the table?
We didn't propose it, so we're looking for the expertise of the council to give a recommendation on this for us.
Yes.
Tiffany, do you wanna highlight the differences here again, once again, between what Colorado's doing and what this would do?
So the difference here would be the total sample size for Colorado is based on the size of the batch. So larger batches, you have to submit more samples even if the lab doesn't need it. The sample method is the same, so there's no change there. The number of containers per production batch to set the lot size is defined specifically by weight in Colorado. So here you're defining what your unit is, whereas Colorado is just saying number of pounds. And then utilizing the ANSI AQL General Inspection Level 2 would be different. They define batch size specifically and say based on pounds produced, you're going to sample this specific number of units. It is not identical to, it's AQL Special S number 3 from the table, which is more stringent than what I've proposed here with the general level 2.
Is this for flour? I'm hearing some folks in the audience behind me saying that edibles are different, treated differently in Colorado.
It's still based on weight units, so like number of cartridges produced, etc., on batch size.
Jessica, can we go back to Murray's slide? Would that be possible, Murray's slides? The next one down, I think, right? Yeah, this one? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Is this what you're trying to bring our attention to? So instead of being defined by weight, they're defined by number of units. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Not specific for edibles.
Yeah. So this would actually, I mean, you'd have to submit more material, right?
Yes.
I think I'm comfortable keeping my motion as is then.
Second.
Do you want to formally make a motion?
I thought he did.
Yeah, I did, but I'll.
Sorry, we were wordsmithing it quite a bit.
Yeah, I'll restate the motion. So, to utilize the ANSI AQL General Inspection Level 2, utilize number of containers per production batch to set the lot size for the sample set, utilize top, middle, bottom, star pattern, or sample thief sampling with composite quartering to arrive at the most homogeneous sample possible. Total sample size to be taken would be a minimum of 4 grams of material per production batch for potency and 12 grams of material per production batch for patient safety to allow duplicate testing and maintain, and then take that part out. Duplicate testing. Yeah, period.
To allow for the last, if need be, is that what we're saying? Or to
As necessary, duplicate testing as needed or as necessary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that doesn't sound like to do it each time.
Yeah.
Second.
We've got a motion and a second. All in favor? Can you raise your hands again for me, please? Sorry. Okay, all opposed? Okay, motion passes. Thank you. That was a tough one, and we appreciate your recommendations on this to help support the rule writing.
Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany. That was great. Okay. These are just some additional considerations that we presented last week regarding transportation and documentation of sample integrity and laboratory numbers. I don't know if the council would like to discuss these or not, or if you want to move on. We'd really like your recommendations related to the remediation and retesting. So if there's no objections, I'm going to keep going. Marie, do you feel like we covered this? Sorry, I stuck it in here. The council opted not to go for water activity testing, but do you feel like the homogeneity is covered in the sample methodology?
I think so, yeah.
All right, so on to remediation then. Steve, I'll let you talk about this table briefly, please.
So this is what, we didn't have a chance to do a full 50 state analysis up here. This is for the states that people were talking about with different states on what to do. So you can see what they are doing for remediation at what point. I think we already have put in some remediation motions as far as if you go back to microbiology, what can be remediated and what can't. So I don't think we've addressed necessarily the solvent metals and the pesticide as far as remediation right now. But I think we might be set on the micro part.
Can you tell us how to read this chart here? What do the X's indicate that you can or cannot?
Yes, that's what they do. They allow.
So the X indicates that they allow remediation.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there's some footnotes at the bottom. This doesn't mean, that this is just what others do, so.
And we've got some other slides related to remediation. I don't want to pass it by if y'all are studying this. Steve put together some additional summaries, and then we have some recommendations for members as well. So this is more of some of the state remediation requirements in here. There's some timeframes for when remediation has to take place in some other states, and some products that don't allow for any remediation, products requiring retesting following remediation. And then some considerations that the department had related to remediation about making sure that products are quarantined while awaiting retesting, so that the dispensary's not selling them, and that they're treated as new lots after remediation, but traceable back to their original lots, and that anything that has been remediated is retested.
We need a remediation for potency since we have set a limit of 20% plus or negative. So if they're 50% over it, what are they going to have to do, throw that away?
No.
They could relabel.
Should we articulate that in here, or do we have to?
Let's see, our potency motion,
20% within label.
or repack, that would be 20% or repackaged to meet the actual concentration. Yeah.
I mean, I think that we should allow remediation for everything unless we already specify that no remediation is possible. And I think throughout the process of our motions for various analyses, we have identified those. So I think, let's see, one way maybe, so if a sample does not pass testing, the producer, the laboratory, and if necessary, the department shall determine whether remediation is appropriate and test another sample from the batch. So we keep the, we have duplicates, so we already have that on hand by the laboratories. Retest in accordance with the requirements of the section, and the cost retest will be borne by the producer or the processor.
So I've got a couple questions here. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
In general, I agree. I think anywhere we can logically and safely allow remediation, we should, to minimize the impact and the costs on the patients that's going to get passed forward. We don't want to be wasting biomass when we don't have to. I hope I'm wondering what you were, it seems like you were reading from something at the end there, perhaps, or?
No, it's my notes.
That's your notes, okay. And could you just repeat that one more time?
So if a sample does not pass testing, and we need to put in here, unless otherwise stated, for no remediation is possible. So if a sample does not pass testing, the producer, laboratory, and I would say, and the department shall determine whether remediation is appropriate and test another sample from the batch at issue or identify processes that will render the cannabis or cannabis-derived products safe and retest in accordance with the requirements of this section. All cost of the retest will be borne by the producer or the processor.
Get that, Jessica?
Yeah, I got it. See?
I would say, I guess I would agree with that, except I'm not sure if we're going to allow it, we don't need to petition the department, I would say. I don't know that the department needs to determine it. I think we can say, unless we've otherwise stated remediation is not possible, yeah.
Aren't there some microbials and metals that can't be cleaned out even with charcoal scrub or anything?
Currently.
Those that we should be looking for, like, that's a strong no?
So our motions that we have passed already, just to cover what's in there for remediation, for E. coli, anything that is greater than 100 CFUs per gram has to be remediated or reprocessed and then retested. There's no remediation possible for salmonella. Any failures on mycotoxins can't be remediated. Heavy metals can't be remediated if the products are above the safety limits. For testing, for pesticides, anything above the safety limits can't be remediated.
Jessica, you're showing, this memo recommendation on the slide that's in front of us right now shows sterilization method for flour to make extracts or concentrates. I'm not aware of a way to sterilize, to remove the microbials. Is this reasonable?
It is. Yes.
Okay, second question. Let's assume in the case of pesticides, so I've got some flour, and I have that tested, and I come back and I fail. And I got a lot of flour, and I'm convinced that you shouldn't see pesticides in it. So I'm going to send it off to these two other labs to test. And I'm hoping like they're going to come in clean and that I'm going to be able to go to my testing lab and say, you had an error here, you know, yada, yada. What happens if those two tests come back and one of them's good and one of them's bad? Do we have
we have slides coming up
that will address
that from the different states. So on how many different labs need to be involved and how many tests need to be involved in making that determination.
Okay.
Quite a bit of details for pesticides. I don't know what our threshold limits are going to be yet, but that'd be a lot of retesting to do and send to other labs because there's quite a bit we get.
But you can understand the investment that somebody will have made in whatever product. They're gonna challenge that test if they're convinced it's wrong. So you're gonna see more.
So in California, you're one and done. So You know, we can come up with whatever we want to do, but it can be anywhere from California. If you fail, you fail, or you can do retesting. But we're coming to that, so I recommend we kind of get through a mediation here before we get into that.
I'm just flashing up another member recommendation related to retesting as well. Excuse me, remediation.
The water activity though, that's not, right.
Yeah, I didn't edit any of the member recommendations, but the council opted not to make motions related to water activity because there wasn't authority within the statute basically to require that. That doesn't mean you can't do it on your own. I don't know.
I don't know why we're getting feedback here. I don't know that system back then.
I think the main way is looking at, right? Fire sign. Is there any reason not to go with this?
Well, the only thing I like about this bill is the instruct initial labs to send a portion of the pretty confident in our tests and the QC, we, double check, review all our data for us to send it off. For the
Responsibility yours, you mean?
yeah, to us, to take your sample, because at this point, we've already stored it with the other samples and things too, because we can't just hold everybody separately. After we're done, we're gonna store it for the amount of time that we're supposed to keep it on hand. And I don't think it's that sample, send it off to the other labs as far as us. If you guys don't trust in our test results, which is fine, you can take it. Remediation doesn't need to be in the lab, you guys can take it to the lab, you get different results and we'll all discuss it.
Well, we'd have to get the sample back from you then, to
I don't
ensure that
think
we're
it's a
testing
good
the same
idea.
thing, isn't it? I mean, what would you do in that circumstance?
I don't think
So
it's
your
a good idea.
recommendation based off the table is just, instead of the or, it would just be the first point?
Yeah, like, I don't think it should be on the lab for remediation purposes.
Or just the second, sorry.
We're just giving test results. At that point, you can do what you want with them, but I don't think it should be the lab's job to send off the sample somewhere else, because we get a lot of retests
So
and.
you don't want it to be your responsibility, totally do that.
Okay, so
How do
we're
we
saying
ensure that this retest?
that the lab, that the lab
I would
retest.
We
I
can
would
keep it on
split
hand.
retest with remediation and just say, if the product has to be remediated or can be remediated, separate it from the retest right now.
And it's possible that you don't feel like what we've addressed with remediation already is sufficient in the motions that we've made regarding what can or cannot be remediated.
We pointed out what couldn't be remediated, right? We have not made the recommendation that everything else can.
Do you want to make that motion?
I'm just not sure how best to make it. Wordsmith.
I mean, just, I mean, so the suggestion is to separate out the retesting, resampling motion from the remediation motion.
Right.
So I think the motion would be that unless explicitly stated otherwise, all products can be remediated. And other yeah.
Because I think the technology, I was back at a conference in Chicago, there's a lot of new stuff coming out.
Definitely.
So
Yeah, and we don't wanna
I would
limit
hate to
ourselves.
set something, as long as everybody involved is cool with it being remediated in a certain way, then I think that would be all right.
Do they automatically apply as one remediation, or do they have 2, 3?
It's got to be retested anyhow after it's remediated, so you're going to have the safeguard of that.
Let's say, remediates, retest, it's lower, but still not below the threshold. Could he remediate again and then retest?
for example, residual solvents, you just keep blowing it down.
Yeah, that's
So that-
on you if you want to continue to chase that rabbit.
Well, another reason you don't want, us to take our potents, like for instance, let's say it's not your packaging claim you've done always have for potency, just let's say on flour or however you're selling it. If I crush up that 1 gram, which is very little for me to get, it's only that big, crush it up, and I take a portion out, what we do is we take the sample and we put it back into the little bag that you brought. You don't want to reuse, I always tell people when we run it, it's going to be a little bit bias low because it's withheld in the trichomes, not the plant material. So those trichomes kind of disperse everywhere, and you're not really getting that same portion. I could take it from 3 different spots. I'm going to vary, not by a whopping 20%, but I'm going to vary. So
My trichomes don't.
But of course.
sure they don't.
I like it.
Second.
So we've got a motion for the language up on the slide and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion passes, thank you. And we'll clean this up, we'll put together a whole summary of motions and all that. I just want to capture it in front of you all. Okay.
So then, oh,
Retesting is the next topic that we're kind of dabbling in here, and Steve put together, and his team put together a summary of state retesting requirements. Who allows, who doesn't. So some states do, some don't. Some require second retestings by different labs of the first one.
So again, after we get everybody on the same page, there shouldn't be really any difference between one lab or another.
Yeah.
At this point, if you were to do that, there would definitely be differences. So,
If they fail at the Tabitha, they should stay there and remediate there, because it's the same thing.
I also think there's a chain of custody risk between having to shuttle between the labs, but I do think that we shouldn't force the situation, and I think that would be when necessary, coordinate with the department. If the producer or the dispensary, the testing client, customer decides to use another laboratory, I think that should, in my mind, should be coordinated with the department because of a chain of custody concern. But do we force that it must be done by the same laboratory? I'm never the one that says you have to use one company, because there could be a situation that arises that we're not thinking of right now. So I just think we should just say has the right to retest, and if the client or the producer wants to use another laboratory for the retest, must be coordinated by in conjunction with the department.
I totally, do I have this? You didn't even turn this on.
I totally agree. I think we want as much flexibility as possible. My worry is the amount of money that individual dispensaries or cultivations will have in an individual product batch. And one test could derail that substantially. You know, we've worked with labs for 7 years, and occasionally we don't understand the results they get. Pretty much you're spot on, and I trust Tabitha, you know, like I do anybody. But things happen. So I would think that we want as much flexibility for folks to retest, to validate what did or didn't happen.
What if you get one pass, one fail?
That's a good question.
then the other states typically require a third one,
That would make sense.
so that it breaks the tie.
So let's hope we have 3 labs on board. Go labs, go.
The chain of custody issue, though, is an important one.
So here's one member recommendation up here, and then there's another one that was submitted as well, just for consideration of the council. You have these in the slides in front of you too. Sorry, Jay, I didn't mean to cut you off. Jay said temperature is also
We have
important.
something in here about the sample has to be delivered the way that it would be consumed, right? And so we're talking about one, keeping the backup sample on shelf at the lab for X amount of time, which things could happen. And then they have to transfer that from A to B, and, you know, things could happen. It just, I see more issues with getting it out of there. And like you said, everybody should be on the same page once we get everything finalized. So if Tabitha says that, you know, it wasn't good then and it's good now, that should be the same report we're probably going to get anywhere else. you know, you don't have to use Tabitha, you could have started with another lab, but I think if they did the testing, they should finish it. You know, and I'd make a motion for that.
I think that's a preference, but I don't think it's a good idea to constrain at this stage.
Yeah, I like the idea of being able to have the opportunity to use other labs as well.
But then we have to do the
What you're
third
saying
one.
makes sense. It's
But
practical.
coordinating, again, coordinating with the department will ensure that the product is transported and all of those things according to shelf life and stability. I think that's why if we say in the motion that if the producer would like to use a second laboratory, that must be coordinated with the department,
Must be approved by the department?
coordinated with.
Okay.
Do we want to quantify then with the third one? Because you're taking, you know, two different people's words, and you're saying one said it was good, one said it was bad, and no remediation.
So I think it
this
would
is up
always
for-
be
to
from
you
that point on
guys.
coordinated with the department.
Because this is your expense, so I think it's really up to you if you, to feel comfortable with whatever decision is going to come. This really needs to come from the dispensaries and all.
It's not apples to apples if it's not really our same product either. And a lot of people
Yep.
get sent a different bottle of this that we got, and they got separate results, but who knows what bottle was homogeneous and not, and how it was stored and whatnot. So that's another reason why you're gonna get varying results in retests that might be clean. Who knows if everyone on the other side's doing their due diligence to pull the same exact sample or when it was pulled, you know?
We really are looking at just, in this case, the retesting is going to be solvents, heavy metals, pesticides.
Not having one of those levels.
No? We won't retest for that? So let's say concentrate comes in and I detect heavy metals. I'll retest, right? If remediation is possible.
If remediation is possible,
Yeah.
unless we stated it.
Yeah, they
Because
may.
a lot with the heavy metals, it's not possible.
Understood,
Yeah.
but just by example, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, that you need to be able to retest to verify. And like I say, if you can't remediate, you can't remediate. This particular slide here is specific to edibles. The duration of the time turnaround in terms of testing is really about edible products, not about other things. And it's really, it goes toward the shelf life.
Yeah, I mean, so Hope, do you have a motion brewing? You know, those timeframes obviously may not work for other things that require other different remediation processes and don't have as much of a shelf life concern.
You know, I think one of the things we need to be mindful of is we're putting the onus on the laboratory to stop what you're doing, hold your business because my test failed, and I'm having, because I had, let's just say, something contaminated in my product, and now I need you to stop doing your testing, stop your business. You've got 72 hours to retest my product to ensure that I'm clean.
That's why I pay the big bucks.
Well, I mean, honestly, I don't think that's a big deal for the labs. They just put it back in the queue. And it's going to be highlighted in some way. I don't know how the current labs are necessarily doing it, but I don't think it's like that. I mean, you put it back in the queue and then it's tagged or flagged because it does have to be completed within a certain amount of time. I mean, I'm thinking within 3 days, regardless of flour, concentrate, edible. I think a 3-day retest is reasonable to propose.
So it seems to me we might need to split this out again, right? If it's retesting for a remediated batch, that's almost like it's a new test, right? Because we're resampling, we're doing a resample, a new batch.
I'm referring directly to
So this
remediation
is
on a retest.
right. Okay, so this would separately would be retest when you think you just got the wrong results, right?
Versus testing and remediation.
Yeah. So I would say we could knock the first one out by saying, you know, retesting for remediated production batches would follow the same procedure as testing in the first place.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we can
a
take
new
the second one up
product.
separately.
Yeah. But then retesting, I'm fine with retesting of 72 hours.
And it's not even relevant for edibles because we'll test if we don't hit potency, we've got a choice of
trashing the batch or relabeling. We generally won't bother to relabel. And anything else, if something did show up, it's trashed anyway. So we don't have the same complexities in terms of retesting on the edible. Did you want to?
Come on, Tabitha, you were shaking your head there.
It's just a time frame for the retest. I mean, you keep in mind, Steve knows that the pesticides and the metals instrument can probably run 100 samples a day. I don't think many labs at this point with MoneyWise is going to have 2 pesticides, 2 metals. So we can only run 100 a day. So if thinking about mandated testing come in with a handful of labs, it's going to be really hard because those are the ones that y'all are going to want remediated immediately. It's going to be very hard to get that within 72 hours.
Also,
Get it started within 72 hours.
Even on the instrument.
Even get it on the instrument.
I would also caution recommending the department put timeframes in rule. That might be a good business practice, how dispensaries determine which labs to use, that kind of thing, but it does get risky to put some of that stuff into rule as a requirement.
With the exception of requesting the analysis, that's reasonable, I see. The time frame for requesting. In other words, that first bullet under the direction that must request a reanalysis.
You have a submission date within that time frame. At least it's at the lab and it's there.
What's the time frame for you? What is that at? 3, 4 days, 5 days?
I have no idea when mandated testing goes into
In other words, I
effect.
can understand how you might constrain the 72 hours for them to do the reanalysis, but is it reasonable to give the time frame to request that reanalysis?
I would just ask the council if they want the department to require them to request within a certain amount of time, or if that's good.
I think it also depends on what percentage is failing. And
Yeah.
if you're mandating the labs to do a
Yeah.
3-day turn, you can't do that.
that's what I was about to
In a
jump in
mandatory
and say.
testing market. It cannot be done.
If we're going to have the same experience as every other state, we may be lucky and not. For example, Michigan, 80 to 90% of the products failed. So what every state has said, it takes about 2 years for this to shake out. And some of these timeframes might be great for once we've hit a normal kind of time period here. But the first 2 years will be, if we're like everybody else, kind of wild. And I'd hate to put time constraints on that.
I'm okay for the first initial start, not putting a time constraint on there. It's not like the labs aren't going to get to it. The labs want to get everything retested. The dispensary or the producer is not going to back off of the lab until they get their updated results also. So I think that there will be follow-through on the retest. So I think those are good points.
And if they don't, then the people are going to go down the road to somebody who's going to retest it.
Maybe the second bullet point, the registrant must request a reanalysis within 48, 72 hours from the date the laboratory sent the notice of the failed test. Might help the laboratories with the storage. You know, if they don't get the request for the retest within the time frame, then they don't have to hold on to the product anymore. That might help them in that perspective.
Timeline that we're going to have the whole
She's going to have hundreds of refrigerators, all this stuff in there.
Yeah.
Well, we're not going to store in refrigerators anymore. That's just too many refrigerators. We got to get rid of 6. So it's going to be in the same way some of the dispensaries have the gates, the gated section, and we'll have it all kind of shelved and housed in there. That's the only way we couldn't fit any more in a refrigerator. So right now, we're keeping everything 14 days because that's our whole time on product testing. But I don't know wasn't there something that we had to keep it on? Maybe that was hemp I'm thinking about, was a certain time frame. But right now, it's just 14 days. But we may not be able to keep it past a week depending on how much product we have in-house. It's too much.
Right.
I mean, so we're going to allow somebody to request a retest from the original lab, or to, I agree. I don't think it makes sense to put the timeframes in there.
No time frames.
Unless to Jay's point, that the producer should request a retest within 48 hours of receiving the results. That way, that gives the lab the heads up that this is flagged for retest, and if it requires proper storage by the laboratory to ensure the retest is performed as best practices possible. So the only requirement for a timeframe might be to notify lab of retest by the producer within 48 hours, I think. Would that work with you, Tabitha, from that perspective?
Knowing that there will be a retest coming on.
Then you would know you would have to hold on to that
Just
one longer.
send in a chain of custody and get it on the queue, like within a certain
Right.
time frame.
I
Then we'll
wouldn't
know
push
it's
it.
there,
Right.
we're gonna be working on it. But we don't need to get a phone call and say we're gonna be sending a test, it's not gonna do us any good.
Right.
Chain of custody is what's gonna do us
So
good.
anything
Those are our.
So are we talking that this is submitting a new sample? Because I thought that was what bullet one was. If it's a retest of a sample that you tested already, I think is what we're talking about. So I would think that you as a lab owner would want to be notified as soon as possible.
We do, we take, yeah.
So you can maintain the integrity of storage.
We do, we pull them out.
So if it's flagged for retest within 48 hours, that tells you as a laboratory that you need to flag that sample and make sure that it's properly stored, correct?
We have a log for that kind of stuff, yeah. Right now, we can make the 48 hour, but I just don't know about the time frame.
Not for completing the test.
But if you let us know within.
But if a retest was requested,
Are you, are you going to have enough material, or is this something that we would be submitting a new sample for anyway?
We should. Typically, if you submit the right amount per test that we're having the 8 grams, if you're getting everything, we should have enough.
I think the way the sampling was
Microbial,
set
though,
up,
no.
that there was enough to have a duplicate
Yeah, it was
set
16
for
or something
testing.
like that.
We have 16 grams, that's right.
So it sounds like, in general, the council would like to allow for retesting for a failed product as an initial, maybe an initial bullet we could put up here, something around that.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, the rule should allow for product retesting to verify results.
Or verify, either way. I think this is recording live this way too, I'm not sure, so you might see all of my.
So product retesting means I didn't get the THC percentage I'm looking for, so I went back and tested again.
Or anything, yeah. I mean, it would be all sorts of different things.
Well, sometimes within a lab, you have a miss shot. There's something obvious, so you would come up low. If you could definitively say that something happened with that sample in the, yeah. So a
I just afraid,
retest.
you know, for my example, the THC percentage is, you know, we could chase the rabbit all day long. Not good enough. Let me go to another one. Let me go to another one. Get the number that I'm looking for. It's not remediation. It's just.
Well, the ISO
You
certification
can
should
do that
take
all
care
day
of that.
long, it's just, it's on, I mean, I can do that all day long, it's just in my pocketbook.
And ISO certification should,
Well, ISO certification really means that you know how to do your paperwork correctly.
Yeah.
And the lab
If I
inspector will
do,
verify that you're doing your job.
if we do our job right, then if the lab if there isn't something technically that happens because like a miss shot, the lab should get very similar results within 3 days. The instrument should still be in pretty similar kind of condition unless there's something really dirty. So the same lab shouldn't be getting drastically different
So if
results.
I test with 3 labs for THC, and I can, on my own choice, pick the highest one. If I test 3 labs for remediation, we don't pick the highest one and say you failed, we pick the lowest one. So it's just like they're both.
Potency is a hard example you're given because you have a 20% variance and you shouldn't have that between.
yeah, so we could limit this to safety.
Right, so you should have plenty already.
So yeah, it's just safety, not potency.
Washington excludes potency from retesting for that reason.
Because we already have a
Anyway,
20%
Safety is
variance.
remediation.
And it is,
Safety
it's
not
gonna be what
product
it is.
retesting. Product retesting is, I decided I wanted something better. Remediation is, I failed and I need to fix this.
So that, Jay, I think it would make sense then to say, to retesting to verify safety results. Because we already have a 20% variable for potency on the label, and that's plenty, so.
I can take that.
You know, on a related question, the requirement is that the labs will send their full testing report to the state.
No.
No?
It is not. The requirement is that the laboratories must produce a technical report.
Okay.
That doesn't,
So this may be a silly question then. You know, one concern we have is we do, you know, R&D like anyone else, and some of that R&D is really intended to try to find out where the cannabinoids go, so that we can ensure our dosing models account for that. So we will be submitting on occasion results which we know will fail certain certain conditions. I don't want that to hurt us in some way.
If you don't
It's not
know,
final product, so there's no concerns about that then, okay.
No, if you think about the department's inspections or anything, we would be, potentially pulling product off the shelf and verifying that your laboratory results for that product are within the safety limits and labeled as such with potency, but not to look at any kind of R&D. Are we comfortable with these motions? Or it's not an official motion, I guess. These bullets, anything else you want to add before a motion?
The 48-hour request for having the sample remediated. You had that on another slide. It was the second
Well,
bullet, I think, the slide before.
Yeah, that would, retesting, but
Was a request of reanalysis.
Well, if you got a weekend in there, you might want to make it 72.
I mean, I don't think it,
2 hours, I think. You'd
With
go back in
holiday?
and say, register must request reanalysis within 72 hours, if you're going to put a time limit on it. And that's really more for
If it's over Thanksgiving weekend,
Right,
you got 4 days, you can't get a hold of us.
right, I mean, if it's important to you, then you'll do it within 48 or 72 hours, I would think. I don't know that it makes sense to put a hard limit in there. I mean, again.
Not unless you feel like it's protected.
I mean, we're gonna keep it for 2 weeks, but, I mean, you don't want to keep it on the shelf with all the others, if you're trying to look at I mean, we keep it separately, but still, I just say, you want to test it as soon as possible.
So does someone want to make a motion for the bullets on this slide?
Yes.
Who would like to do
I'm happy to make that motion. Motion to allow retesting for remediated production batches to follow the same procedure as the initial testing, and a motion that the rules should allow for product retesting to verify safety testing results.
a motion and a second? All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? No. Okay, let me all opposed? Okay, motion passes, thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna do a quick time check. We've got 30 minutes left. We're gonna cover disposal. We've got a couple additional items, and I will be jumping to the agenda item related to the final report at 11:15. So for disposal, we've got some considerations for disposal, essentially about marijuana waste being secured in a locked location prior to destruction, documentation maintained for marijuana waste, record keeping, retention policies for laboratories, and, sorry, Steve.
And if you look at the bottom there, we're pulling some of this from an actual conference where they were presenting on waste here. Not that you have to follow, but that's the sources that we're
Yeah.
getting some of this from.
I just want to make sure we're not referencing anything related to federal law here that wouldn't obviously make any sense.
So, in the past, I followed pharmacy, so to make it unrecognizable or unusable, there's a lot of different ways, and I think that probably would be sufficient, but from the pharmaceutical industry, for pharmacies, for medications, because we don't want to flush it, we don't want to put it down drains, et cetera, and we also want to make it so even though it might not be recognizable and it may not be usable, if it still smells, that would be an attractant. And so kitty litter was one of the approaches actually recommended by pharmacies for destruction. And so it makes it basically an unusable, unrecognizable, unsmellable brick. And you could buy that in bulk. And so we probably don't necessarily need to dictate that, but this was maybe an expansion that it also, if we are going to be putting it into a public waste, and maybe it should not smell because we don't want people going through dumpsters, for example, but. Oh, that's too bad for you.
What we currently do is we just dispose all of it in a solvent waste. We have a satellite waste location in the lab and have it I forget what the name of it. We have a waste disposal company that picks it up, but they profiled it and they dispose of it accordingly. And then we don't put anything in the trash, nothing. Everything is dumped in the same medibles, take out of packaging. CBD products, sometimes because there's no THC, we can put in the trash. Tinctures, they all get dumped down. We don't rinse bottles or anything like that, but everything, those type of things just go right into the trash and that's all disposed of. And it's solvent waste. And it's just real simple. It's all just disposed the same way.
So an industrial solvent waste company comes and takes
They do. We profiled it and told them everything that's in it, and it's their job to look at those compounds and see what the proper way to dispose of it. But it's considered killed THC once we have disposed of the solvent, unusable. So we just mark on the chain of custody the dispose date, and that we dumped it, and then sign off on it and file away our chain of custody.
Which would be good, because even when you do this, we've heard that there's still people in the back trying to use it, even though it's got kitty litter and all kinds of things.
We've had
there.
those issues. They get into the dumpster and stuff like that, and you signage, you put locks, you put security and all that stuff. There's a lot of different ways to mitigate this. We add coffee grounds, for example, to ours. But when we've gone to the local jurisdiction, in our case, the City of Tucson, and said, well, we'd like to deal with this, or gone to Waste Management who handles it, they look at us like we're crazy. The City of Tucson wants us to have an agreement with the Waste Management. Waste Management doesn't even want to talk about the issue. So be careful about what we ask for here, because jurisdictions will be different. They won't have specific requirements. I think the issue is that it goes solid waste and not liquid, to be sure that it's not put down the drain if something is a liquid form. Short of that, I think the standard practices that have been followed as part of the original statute have worked really well for us.
The council could consider recommending something as simple as laboratories must maintain policies and procedures for waste disposal that render marijuana unusable and unrecognizable.
That sounds great. Just make that motion.
Would you write that out and we'll make that motion?
I have to go. Thank you, guys. It's been fun.
Thank you, Tabitha.
Thank you, Tabitha.
Sorry.
In our environmental regs, we have something that has to meet all federal, state, and local requirements for disposal. We don't want to.
We can't have that because of the federal.
If it's federal, they're going to require an
Okay.
EPA certified person or a.
So in a year or so, we'll come back and change this.
Probably so.
That's all right. I mean, this is the motion we're kind of.
Yeah.
Just laboratories? No, that's already in the regs for.
For dispensaries, I already have. So the motion is laboratories must maintain policies and procedures to render waste unusable and unrecognizable.
Second.
Nicely done.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, great, motion passes. Thank you. We've got some additional items as necessary to cover, and the first thing that I wanted to talk about was to revisit solvents. I think Steve at a prior meeting had mentioned that one of the downfalls in other states had been when the state had come back around after recommendations had been made and blindsided people. So I wanted to let you know, as we've been talking here about solvents, we are still a little bit uncomfortable with the solvents that have been recommended by the council and would like to explore adding some additional solvents. Steve Baker put together this summary table, again, to revisit, and then there's a second table in there that shows what the state would be more comfortable with, that has the limits and the particular solvents in there that we would recommend seeing added or changed. The council can choose to discuss or make a motion around this, but it's still something that we're talking about and considering, so I wanted to make sure you all had that information.
So if you go back to that one, so we put up here what the MTAC has recommended. We're not quite sure why it's just 13. If there's, when we look around the neighborhood here of other states, they definitely have more, except for Colorado.
And again, the Colorado people don't believe in their regulations. So I wouldn't
Steve,
use
could you
that.
explain that as you're talking about this, the color coding on the table?
Okay, so the green is for the USP Class 1s. The yellow that goes across is for the Class 2 and 3. So when I highlighted in brown there, those are ones that where there's a USP limit that the council didn't vote on. They have something different than the USP, and then what's in white isn't coming from any USP limit. It's just was voted on. So the first thing we were looking at was there seems to be quite a difference in, for example, xylene level at 1 when the standard that the other states are using is 2170. So we wanted to just make sure that what was voted on is really what we want to do when it's not what the other states in the neighborhood are doing. So I don't know where.
When you compile this, is there clinical data to support why they picked these values?
For USP?
Well, just why, so I think we did based off of the USP for xylenes. I'm not sure if that's, at least that's how I'm recalling it. And so if the other states went with the higher value, was there a reason and rationalization, or was that product specific? In other words, how it was consumed?
Well, I think that's what we were asking you, because we can see what the USP level is.
Yeah.
If the other states adopted a certain standard that's out there, we were wondering where you came up with 1. So we just highlighted a couple of things to make sure that what was voted on, because first of all, there's 2 issues really here. Are the levels in the brown really what we want to do, because they're inconsistent with the USP standard, and what other states have adopted. And then we have a concern that we might be a little bit light on the number of solvents. We need to make sure that we have the tools here to do what we need to do. We wanted to know if, since 13 were chosen, is that what most people use for solvents? Has that been compiled? Is that coming off of the data from laboratories?
So I think it has been what is predominantly used, because we also run the risk, just because we have these chosen ones, that some operator may jump in and start using another one. And I think we should expect that that's likely to happen, especially as technology, it may not be based off of bad intentions, but it could be as just tastes or methods evolve. So these are the most common that have been found by the laboratories, I believe.
Okay, so in the final 2 categories there, I have Arizona Lab 1 and Arizona Lab 2. So our labs are doing more solvents already than what we're proposing. And
for potency as well.
right, so again, when I talk about a mix, most of these are coming in on a mix already. They're already doing this work. So these are 2 of your actual laboratories. The asterisks there, I don't have the actual level that they're testing, but you can see that those 2 laboratories are generally doing more than what we're talking about. Also, when you look at California and some of the other ones, they have in their IPA, which is almost, and they have dichloromethane. So when we talk to Michigan, they have 23, I think. They've seen 22 of these solvents. So when you don't set up a safety limit based on what is being used in the mainstream necessarily. You set up a safety limit to be able
in our case, we would hope that we would be gathering a standard from people that have already had a lot of testing done. That is normal out there. We'd hope that these other states have a list that, because of what they've seen. So I don't want to set up a light list like Colorado where they are getting executive orders and emergency rulemaking to try to compensate for what we didn't do. So what we were talking about is, I think, some of the, adding four more. Like,
Ray, you can help me hope. Have you ever seen chloroform or dichloromethane in any samples?
Yes. Yes, we have, but very infrequently, but that doesn't mean anything, the fact that it's there. But George, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Again, I start to get very uncomfortable when we talk about adding things from a safety perspective, not being a clinician and none of us having that voice. So we can talk chemistry, but from a clinician standpoint, or the actual rationalization for what these safety limits should look like and the numerous different ways that the cannabis is consumed becomes, I get very uncomfortable in that regard, that none of us have that expertise.
So Steve, just to clarify here, when you, in the areas of red or that we're adding or what you're suggesting we add or change from our previous recommendation, and the limits you put in here for that would be derived from the USP, is that correct?
except for the one, the acetone is 1,000, I can at least see where that's Colorado's level.
That's been voted on by the council already. I think Ryan was
Gotcha.
asking about
Yeah,
the new.
so, yeah, in red, those are either adding new ones and bringing the levels up to the USP.
In the case of xylene.
Well, there's two of them there. There's also isopropyl acetate.
I can tell you that we already test for all of those. The standards are readily available, and, we use GCMS technology for residuals, and all of that's going to be easy.
Yeah, so again, this isn't hard for the labs to do this. And again, we don't want to start behind we're not proposing anything that's wild here. We just want to make sure that we have enough here to be able to do our job here at the department.
Yeah, I think I would be comfortable supporting these changes. I mean, 1 part per million of xylene seems awfully low. And I don't know much about xylene, but I think that's.
Colorado's is 430 and Missouri's is 150.
So maybe that was an oversight, perhaps. So I'd be comfortable supporting this.
I make a motion, we make modifications to previously approved motions to change the limits on, I think it's benzene and xylene, and adopt the additional solvent compounds for approval.
Don't leave isopropyl at 1,000?
Do you want to make a motion to adopt this table?
I make a motion to adopt the table. Thank you.
Second.
Second. Thank you, Jessica.
No problem. I'm just.
Use a lot of words.
I'm just putting it down here for ease because I can't see the insert a text box. Motion to adopt this table, right? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, motion passes. The next, no, I think I missed my slide in here, but I need it for the final report. So, no, thank you. We made a motion at previous meetings related to microbial contamination and which appendix to use, which AOAC appendix to use, and we moved to use Appendix K for that microbial contamination. The appropriate AOAC appendix for microbial contamination is Appendix J. So I would, and we didn't catch it for a couple times, and I think I missed throwing those slides in here, but I would appreciate it if the council would move to change K to J and microbial contamination methods to be consistent with AOAC.
I make motion that we change the I know, recommendation for microbial testing from K to J.
Is there a way we can see what K to J looks like?
It was just the wrong. It was for the AOAC, and
Okay.
it cited the wrong appendix. So J is the microbial contamination appendix, and K is something that's not that. What it covers pesticides and solvents and
Okay.
all that, right?
Yep, one's chemistry, one's micro.
Okay.
Okay, one's chemistry, and gosh, one's micro.
Although if you're using an HPLC for your Aspergillus, then you probably would use the chemical one. So if it's a chemical method, you'd use one. If it's
So we could say, actually, so I have it in front of me on the draft, microbial testing should be conducted using the BAM FDA 2013A and validated by AOAC Appendix J or K as relevant, or other federal or international standards that meet the criteria.
I like that. All micros go in chemistry anyhow, so we need to be a little flexible on that.
That's a lot of pressure.
Good job.
As relevant.
You can all see how bad of a typist I am.
Oh, you're doing pretty good.
That's what you said. Oh.
Yep.
There's a motion here.
Second.
All in favor? All opposed? I'm jumping to the final report. I will come back, but I need to talk about this before we adjourn. In law, the department has a requirement to submit a final report regarding the marijuana testing advisory council findings and recommendations. This goes to the governor, speaker of the House, Senate President, and includes the findings and recommendations of this council. You'll see that I began the draft of the report. I completed it to the extent possible. If you've had a chance to look at it, it covers the statutory authority of this committee, our council membership and record of business, and then it goes into the different sections that we considered. They each bullet out the motions that we've made to date in here, which would also be added into the executive summary. That's where the full list of motions made by the council would go. We've got a couple of options here to get this report approved. This is why I've been typing on the board today. We can, which I don't recommend, reconvene as a council after I write the entire report to adopt the report and vote on it. Or we can have a motion today to adopt all motions approved today to be added verbatim into the final report, so that I wouldn't make any additional changes other than dropping the final motions from today into the appropriate sections of the final report, and then putting the entire list into the executive summary.
So in other words, you're asking us to trust you. Which, so far, other than maybe a typo here or there.
I certainly don't have any problem trusting you.
We have to have a public meeting because it's an open body.
I will ask you consider changes where you make reference to all final products must be tested. To change that to something that's more appropriate, all products, but please drop the word final if it's needed.
Well, I think that exemption we put in the
I hope.
other motion would cover that, right?
Yeah.
For your concerns?
Maybe.
Are we changing this again?
Not to be annoying here, but to play devil's advocate, if we were inclined to want to review the final report before we adopt it, what would our option be? Would it be to come back here on Christmas Eve? Is that what we're talking about? Or is there an option?
Yeah, there would be an option of coming together sometime over the holidays if we can achieve quorum in order to
Your
approve
gift
the
anyway,
final.
so there you go.
I'm out of state.
Can it be done telephonically? Attendance? Well, no, I mean, have the open meeting, but can we get a quorum telephonically? If somebody is out of state, can they call in telephonically?
Unfortunately, no. There's Attorney General meeting, or, opinions to the fact that there has to be in person as part of being open to the public. We just can't have people calling. So that's why we're hesitant to
And I'm
do
here.
that. We need to have enough bodies in the room.
How many people can make a Tuesday meeting next week? Raise your hand.
That's not quite a quorum.
I can see how thrilled you are, but.
How many people do we need for a quorum?
We need 7 for a quorum. It does not need to be a Tuesday.
Okay.
I would say 2, if that gives you a little bit more
Yeah.
flexibility. It'd be Christmas.
Do that to yourself.
What about Monday?
Would you guys be willing to meet next Monday?
I mean, all things being equal, I'd like to review the final report before we adopt it.
We tried real hard to get
Yeah.
it done, but we had a lot of.
I'm available on Monday, the 23rd.
Yep. I make a motion that we we meet again on Monday the 23rd to review and hopefully approve the final report.
I second that motion.
It would be a very short meeting.
And then
And we'll have an opportunity to review it beforehand.
Will we get away from flour that day?
We'll be able to review the final report before that meeting, yes? Okay. Or the draft.
Jessica, are we going to do the rollout recommendations? I didn't see them.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that now. I just wanted to make sure we covered the final report pieces first. So we have a motion and a second on the table to reconvene on Monday. We're gonna try our best to find a room that is adequate to, it may not be this room, just so y'all know.
I mean, we could be in the lobby, right?
Probably gonna be
together. We can
Right.
meet next door in the kitchen.
And
All in
lobby
favor?
is public.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. All right, we've got a couple more minutes to close out these additional recommendations. One is this one that was submitted and we discussed previously related to delaying the November 2020 implementation deadline.
So I might jump in since I've seen all the labs. I'm probably the only one in the room that has been through all the labs. The first thing was if the laboratories couldn't get their certificate of occupancy, there was no way we were going to get here. But Tabitha has broken through with Phoenix, and so they will do it now. Marana is an option for everybody. They will actually do it. I think Scottsdale, there's been some progress there. So I think that issue, as long as you find the right individual, that's not going to be as much of an issue. So I think we're good there. So then it comes to where are the labs? And I've been through all those in the last week and a half here. So I have their currently where they're at.
You mean where are they at in the process?
At the process, have they bought the instruments? There's a wide difference between the laboratories. We have some that are very close to being ready to go. They're already doing organ lists. They're already got redundancy. There's a lot, and there's some that were waiting for these standards before they buy these instruments. So when I look at this as a whole, I think that we should, before we make a determination, most people are talking about getting their ISO certifications here in February, by February, March, to be able to get on that first step. And then the majority of, or enough laboratories to have capacity to do this, I believe, if they follow through with what they're telling me, to have their final ISO inspections and certification, plus the inspection we would do, if we're getting that done. I think that right now we may have that ability to have the capacity. That's a may. I'm not, because there's a lot of issues that have to fall through. We have one lab A couple labs that are extremely close from being where we need them.
I will also note, in consideration of this, that this is a statutory change, so it would be a recommendation that could go in the report, but not something that the department could implement, just as a.
So the labs that have already been working to make sure they have redundancy and their ISOs, I know would be really upset if this were delayed. I've already seen emails to that effect because they feel like the others have waited too long. Have been.
So-
Steve, won't a lab have to be ISO certified in every test?
Yes. Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. You could just be ISO certified for pH and, and then it doesn't have any relevance to,
So what's the status on that? Are all of these?
well, that's what I'm saying. I believe we will have, if the labs follow through with what they're telling me, I think we will have capacity. We'll have the capacity by November 1st.
So if, on that, and again, because of the statute, I wrote this up really quick. I'm going to read it and then just do a brief explanation. So this would be for staggered implementation recommendation. So the DHS may waive testing requirements of this section in whole or in part if the department determines that the number of laboratories approved to conduct a given test is insufficient for all testing samples to be appropriately processed. The department may also adopt and enforce a staggered random testing schedule for sampling and testing of dried usable cannabis and concentrated cannabis-derived products by the licensed nonprofit producers. So that actually, the reason why I thought of the staggered implementation and random testing is that we are still testing within the time frame. And it's random, so it's allowing the producers to know that at any point somebody could come in and be shopping and testing their shelves, but it's more of a soft rollout. And so I don't know if that would be something that would be possible to entertain because we still would be testing.
Hope from the patient's perspective, I think that's a really good plan because obviously we can't go against the statute, but we also want to make sure that there are no gaps in the chain, especially for the patients. So I would second that if that were a motion, absolutely.
So, and again, you can certainly make the motion, the council can recommend. It's not something that we can enforce at this time because the statute does require all products to be tested. But it could go in the report as a recommendation.
Is this something that could be reviewed in 6 months' time? Would you know more about where the labs are at? We're all ahead of November.
I would hope by March, I will have a, I think, pretty definitive, if you're not getting your original ISOs done by March, you're going to have a hard time meeting, because the dispensaries are really going to need to start submitting these by September 1st to be able to get all these products in. So the labs are going to have to be certified before September 1st, and if they haven't got their ISO certifications really in mind, they're not going to make it by that time.
Scheduled to meet in April or May or something like that, so, right?
The council made a recommendation to reconvene in 6 months. So that would put it to June. I'll note though that's after the legislative session. And so.
Yeah, I think we will, I mean, if we're gonna put this recommendation in, it's gotta be before then, because.
We're looking to drop the first rules in April. So there might, if you want to have something just before that.
So again, from just from the legislative perspective, bills have to be introduced earlier into the process. So that if this is something that anyone would take from this council's recommendation report and put it into legislation for this legislative session, it would need to be in the report that gets submitted December 31st.
And then it wouldn't.
It doesn't mean we couldn't discuss it additionally as a council.
And then most bills don't come into law until late August, so we'd have to drop something else at that point.
So we need to do something, if we're gonna put a caveat in there, as Hope is suggesting, we need to do it now.
I like Hope's approach because it's flexible, right? It doesn't require a delay. If the labs are there and DHS believes that there's adequate capacity, then we move forward as is. And I agree. I think we need to at least put this as a recommendation just in case. We don't know what we don't know, and things always, in the marijuana world, things always take longer than you anticipate, always. So I like Hope's approach.
Yeah? You ready? Okay, so DHS may waive, or department, may waive testing requirements of this section in whole or in part if the department determines that the number of laboratories approved to conduct a given test is insufficient for all testing samples to be appropriately processed. The department, let me see where you're at. The department may also adopt and enforce a staggered random testing schedule for the sampling and testing of dried, usable cannabis and concentrated cannabis-derived products by licensed nonprofit producers.
And concentrated cannabis, I got stuck on spelling it.
Cannabis-derived products.
I'm just concerned about the number of labs. Right now, we're looking at, 4, 5, 6 labs in total that are trying to get this accreditation. When I go and I drop off samples out of labs for my competition, they have a hard time doing all those samples in one go. So, I'm reading this as, even if we got all 5 labs on board, are we going to be able to process them in a timely manner? And you're saying, Department Chairman said the number of labs approved to conduct any given test is insufficient. I mean, we're already probably going to be insufficient with all 6 labs running because there's so much product, 120 dispensaries.
But the labs are also ramping up. They're buying even extra. We have certain labs that are doubling, tripling, and looking at quadrupling the number of instruments that are currently from what you're probably used to, because they were waiting on these regs to see what they were going to have to buy. So now that they know, I've seen a whole bunch of them, and there's more than 5.
But the 2 pesticide machines, she said they could do 100 a day. She's got 2 machines, she's in over 500K, she's only doing 200 samples a day. And there's how many of these guys out there? I'm just afraid that this is going to, we all block it for a long time.
We really do. We're
That's-
really worried about that
Yeah.
because of what happened in Oregon. We're afraid that we're going to come up to this and we're going to find out we've got 5 testing labs and they can't handle it. And that's why we'll meet in March. Steve will give us the current and we'll raise heck then if we need to.
But remember, Jay, safety testing is different than potency testing.
So, yeah.
Is it specific to one or the other?
So right now, I think that we have, if they can get their ISO in on time, we have capacity already for potency, residual solvents, and most of the micro. We're not talking about everything here. I already think that we have that kind of capacity to handle those. What we're talking about here are the pesticides and the metals. We only have one lab currently that does ICP mass spec.
And then you're just dropping the
One
pesticide
lab.
to meet the demand? Is that what you're saying?
What lab are you with?
So the other
Okay.
other bullet
Well,
there says it would
IAS,
be random
as far as we know,
testing,
does
so
not
it
have an
wouldn't that,
ICP mass spec. They
if
have
there's not
2
enough labs to meet that
ICP
demand,
OASs.
then it could roll it to a random sampling, so it's not as if it's not being tested for, but it's just not every product would be tested for, so.
So we have an insider IAS.
Because he didn't get drawn for the random sampling? Or
As far as we know, there's only one lab that has an ICP mass spec. Others are in the process of getting them. So we have labs that already have operators that they can run them. It's just a matter of that instrument coming in. So again, I think we need to see how we are. I think we're going to be very different place in February or March. I will know by that time.
So we've got, I'm sorry, we have to wrap up, we have other.
Yep.
People coming into use this room. Is someone interested in making a motion on this?
Oh, I think I did. I thought I did when I was reading it out.
Second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, motion passes.
Can we pick a date, March?
No, we talked about it. It doesn't need to go about.
Okay.
So our next meeting, we've got this room held on Monday, the 23rd, from 11 to 11:30. And we'll send all that out over email as well as the final report as soon as possible.
You can add to the agenda to pick a date in March.
Jessica, are we not able to go through these quick recommendations in the end? I know okay, so we'll just put them in the report or just not have them at all, or what are we gonna do there?
I think they're good guidance.
Okay.
They will be included in the slides that are posted online. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Yes, now you can talk to anybody you want. Actually, you can talk to anybody.
By the way, I really good thank you as well. I told Ryan, I like her. I will say, I like her. Yeah, that's just what I thought. And I told him to talk to that guy. Got audited by the labs now, so I
Oh, yeah.
I know where the equipment is, I know where they are, I have timetables and stuff.
Yeah.
He sent me an email, so I have them looking into specific questions. But they are back. But the best thing is to get your stuff in so you can be